Hey, Patrick Flynn, welcome to the show, man.
It's good to be here, Brent. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and thanks for jumping on short notice. For those who don't know, we were back and forth on Twitter, and our good friend Jordan Goldstein had suggested you join the pod, and you're gracious enough to, within a day's notice, book a slot and give me a copy of your book.
Well, yeah, there is a little bit of pressure for why I did that. My wife is due actually in a couple of days, not too long from now, so I might be offline for a while here presently. So.
Cool. Well, I'm really glad I caught you then, because this is the topic of your book. Your book is titled "The Best Argument for God." It's a huge topic of interest for me. I am a lay philosophy nerd. I am not anywhere in the realm of Jordan or you. I'm not in that space, but I'm infinitely fascinated by philosophy. And
I don't know, man. Sometimes I talk with people who say that, and they're a lot sharper than some of the other people that peer review my papers. I'll tell you that.
Maybe, but I consider I'm a knucklehead on the internet that's just super curious, and I like exploring ultimate questions.
Yeah,
and so for me, this is a really interesting topic. So if you could you basically do the TLDR on your book?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's called The Best Argument for God, and to virtue signal modesty. That doesn't mean it's a good argument, right?
Just best one out there.
It's the best one we got, right? No, I think it's a good argument. It's one that ultimately convinced me. I'm somebody who used to be an atheist. Now I'm a classical theist. There's different kinds of theism out there. It's a camp I fall in. And this book really started as a project by considering very seriously what I think is a very serious argument against the existence of God. And that argument goes something like this, Brent. It says, hey, if two theories can explain just as much, drawn an explanatory par, then just go with the simpler theory, right? But naturalism, and naturalism is sort of a philosophically developed form of atheism, right? And theism, they're on an explanatory par. But naturalism is simpler, so you should just be a naturalist, right? That's not like a definitive proof against God, but it was always an argument that kind of struck me as interesting and to various degrees persuasive, at least when I was a naturalist, right? So yeah, over time I started to realize, actually, I think that's totally wrong. I think the opposite is the truth. So the whole thesis of my book is this: naturalism can only explain some, but not all of what theism can, but only when strapped with vastly greater complexity, right? And what that allows me to do is it allows me, as a sort of philosopher who's interested in worldview comparison and metaphysics and all these different things that philosophers think about, is line up a sort of list of explanatory targets, the types of things like broad scale features of reality that if you're a philosopher, your worldview should be able to explain that or make sense of it or render it intelligible. Things like contingency, like why do some things exist when they don't have to exist, the moral dimension, the qualitative experiential dimension, the rational dimension, even the dimension of suffering and evil, which often is considered perhaps that's the best argument against God, right? So I take that up, and at each chapter, each section of the book, I make the case, right, that theism, in some instances, I think is really the only like horse in the race in terms of explanation. I just honestly, in some instances, I don't think naturalism really has an adequate explanation at all of some things. Other times, I think the naturalist has kind of an explanation, but it's often a very contrived one. It's ad hoc. It doesn't usually fit within the inner logic of the naturalistic system. And so there's some sort of complexity costs that are required there for it to keep up in the explanatory game. So the argument might be considered a cumulative case, right? It's not just one argument. It's many, many different arguments, which I think are kind of, if you think of worldview comparison as sort of a scale, you got like theism over here, naturalism over here, and then you have, weights in the scale, right, that push in favor of one or the other. I'm just piling weights up on the side of theism sort of throughout the book. So yeah, that's what it's about. There's a lot in there. Yeah.
Cool. I admittedly haven't made it all the way through the book.
I would be very impressed if you did. I'd be impressed if you even flipped it open.
No, I've gone through a significant portion of it, and it's been fascinating. And so I wanted to talk about a couple of things because I feel like, first of all, just full disclosure up front, I am an atheist.
Yeah.
Although I consider myself the most open-minded atheist there is. Right. I'm not a strong atheist. I'm not making a strong claim that gods can do not exist, right? That's
Right.
not where I'm at. And this is where I think you and I maybe are opposing in this view, right? I think you rightly called out as sort of like a version of Occam's razor, right? Like the simplest explanation tends to be the correct one. That's like a variant of that argument you're deploying. But I differ a little bit when it comes to like your perceived view of what atheism tends to explain or tries to explain, right? And so like from your book, it says atheism can only explain some but not all of what theism can explain, and it can only do so when strapped with greater complexity. So believe theism. Like that's your basic argument of the book. And whereas as an atheist and also a philosopher, like I love philosophy, man. I think these are two separate domains that, well, not separate, they overlap. I think everyone should realize that science, I think you call out in the book perfectly, like science is actually a subset of philosophy. I mean,
it used to just be called natural philosophy, right?
Yeah, and so I don't see these things as like competing or warring things.
The boundaries are not as clear as people sometimes like to think they are, right?
Yeah, so I take like a synthesis position. I completely agree. Like there's a realm of facts, and that's where science reigns supreme, and there's a realm of values, right? And that's where philosophy comes in, right? So you talk about ethics, you talk about a lot of problems, metaphysics, that are squarely in the philosophical realm, right? So with that said, it's like I don't think that atheism's job or duty is to explain everything, right? I think atheism, at least the way I conceptualize it, my personal view is that it is just a state. It's a cognitive state of not being convinced about the claims made by deists, theists, like whoever's making a positive claim about the nature of whether you talk about contingency, like whether or questions of whether nothing is even possible to exist. Is there a contingent a necessary being called God who causes all of reality that we're encompassed in? I think I'm not trying to take on some of those claims and disprove those claims, right? Like I'm just sort of in a state of like I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced by the arguments and evidence.
Right. So it sounds like you would be what might be called a sort of a weak atheist or a strong agnostic or something like that.
Well, I think agnostic is a correct term, right? I know people have may have different terms they're working with. So I oftentimes like to just ground on terms, ground on definitions. It's really important so we don't talk past each other.
Right.
And I say agnostic for me means that it is an unanswerable question. That's my claim. Like questions of whether gods exist, that's an unanswerable claim. There's no possibility for a null hypothesis. Therefore, we all rational people have to maintain agnosticism, although you can be agnostic and then have a belief. Like I'm convinced that gods exist. I'm not convinced that gods exist. Those both are agnostic positions. You're just one in the affirmative, one in the negative, right?
And that's a good distinction you're making, because there's stronger and weaker forms of agnosticism, right? There's a strong form that says we can't know. And there's the weaker form which says I just don't know. Maybe we can know. I just don't know, right? And the other point about the atheism, that's another important distinction too. And it's one that I think is important to draw for these debates. I don't think an atheist is under an obligation to explain anything if they don't want to. I don't think an atheist is under an obligation to explain anything. If you just want to report your psychological state, that's fine. But I'll not to be a jerk about it, I'll just say I'm just not terribly interested in that, right?
Right.
But if you're doing philosophy of religion and you're doing worldview comparison, right? And this is where I talk with a lot of theists and atheists, and you're bringing forth a worldview as an explanatory proposal. Well, now we're doing the explanation.
Yes.
And not just explanation, but what we would call comparison across various theoretical virtues, explanatory comprehensiveness, simplicity. So if you're just not in that realm, that's fine. I don't have an issue with that. I'm not going to say, explain this to me, or you can't be an atheist. I don't care, right? That doesn't bother me, right?
Yep.
I'm just interested in talking with people who are bringing something to the explanatory table, right? And whether it's a version of naturalism or theism or, there's a lot of those, that isn't a perfect partition, right? There's a lot of logical space there of other worldviews as well. So it just really depends on the type of conversation that you're having. So your position is perfectly legitimate. When people say, well, I'm just kind of describing my psychological state, it's fine. I can describe mine. and then we can go have a beer, and that's
Yeah.
great. But if you're doing a certain branch of philosophy, well, now you're presumably trying to offer something up of a world picture, of a worldview project, and that's what I'm interested in, is how do those games play out, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yep. And I respect the hell out of you, because for those who haven't tried, that's a very difficult task.
Oh, dude, it's so hard, man. That's the one thing I tell about philosophy. And like you say, you're not a philosopher, and you are, man. As soon as you're like thinking deeply, that's what philosophy is, man. It's thinking hard about things. That's like the best definition of it. You can give a more technical definition, but I just like that. As soon as you're thinking hard about things, you're making that sort of critical, reflective turn, you're a philosopher, right? And one of the first things you realize, right, you don't have to be in the game for 10, 20 years, is it's hard. It's really hard. Even the most basic stuff is really, really hard. And that's one thing I try to get people to realize too, is as soon as you do that, you're far more likely to discover a lot more truth, because you'll be more humble, you'll be more cautious. You realize that there are really, really smart people who hold positions that are completely opposed to you. And that should make you think harder, right? And those, I think we agree that like that's all good stuff, right? That's valuable stuff, right? The sooner you realize those things, right? It's not something to like be afraid of or despair about. Sometimes people despair about it, like, oh man, these people are all so smart, they all disagree, right? And then they despair. I guess you could. I just haven't, right? It's challenging, but I've found at the end of the day, it's just extremely, and I'm sure you've had the same experience. It's just, there's just a richness in that challenge, right? And there's a reward in just doing the damn best you can, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people lose, some of the joy in these types of discussions that people lose, is tied to their perceived view that this is so hypercritical they get it right, that they don't have the ability to let go for a second, detach the ideas from themselves as an identity, like the ego, like this is these ideas are not me, they're separate. And maybe be playful with them, maybe don't take it so seriously, maybe open your mind and have like a back and forth with somebody that might have a different view, and look at that as like a fun like you're playing tennis. Hey, you hit a ball, I hit a ball, and we kind of back and forth, and both of us should walk away better for the exchange. Like I think there's a lack of that today.
You remind me of my friend Josh Rasmussen. He said almost something exactly. He's a great philosopher. I've referenced him a few times in the book. He's done some really interesting work in philosophy of mind, but he's had that exact idea. It's like make your identity a truth seeker, right? Because then you don't have to like, get so emotionally attached to any particular argument, right? And at the end of the day, you should see arguments as tools, and should see objections as tools, right? Arguments are hopefully trying to, get you somewhere, and then objections test the strength of those arguments, right? Like you don't want to rest your case on weak arguments, right? So the frame you're talking about, I'm a huge fan of, right? When you understand that your target is just something that I think we can all pretty much agree is worth having, truth, and that's what you're after, it helps you create this sort of distance, a safe distance where you can play with ideas, right? And you can avoid these sort of like, oh man, he's an atheist, so I have to attack him, or he's Christian, or he's not Christian. No, as long as you find people who agree on these things like we do, then you can have a genuine, very fruitful, fun, and profitable sort of, I like the idea of, you say, tennis match. That's good.
Yeah, it's like a volley. Hey, I hit one, you hit one back. Like I think that is a good way to look at it. If people looked at and this could be in politics, this could be in anything where we have disagreements about.
Yeah.
Most of the time when people encounter a person who has a different idea as them or a different belief, their hackles get up, they get defensive, they get all tribal, they start pushing away from that person, maybe they start attacking them. And as opposed to approaching it with curiosity and being like, oh, cool. Like, wow, like we're both different people and we're seeing this completely different ways. How cool is that? Let's explore it. And ask genuine questions. Why do you view it that way? What's leading you to that conclusion? I think we all have got pieces of this puzzle, and we're all trying to figure out the same questions. And the less we push back against each other and attack each other, like I think we're going to get a lot further just by cooperating and discussing things in good faith.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, because what's the opposite, right? The opposite is you either fight or you just ignore each other, and neither of those seem like great. Like they've been tried, right? And they're just not effective. You said something else there I wanted to pick up on because it was really good. Oh yeah, yeah, it helps that I think it helps that I've changed, like I've been in these other positions, right? Like I don't think atheism is irrational at
Mhm.
all. I've said that in public many times. I would hope not, because I used to hold pretty strongly to that position. And in fact, I often like to tell people, like, I don't even think that I really gave up much of what I believed before. I think I just realized there's a different way of conceptualizing God that I hadn't encountered before. And that actually attracted me. Like all my old sort of ways of objecting to theism, of like, I think I pretty much still hold all of those. There was just this other, like, very traditional Neoplatonic understanding of what God is that I had never understood or even been exposed to before. That was just, yeah, like a new conceptualization that sort of opened up a new space for me, right? If that makes sense.
It
And
does. And real quick, like I before we get too far off course here, like I really, really wanted to ground on the question of what's your definition of God, right? Like what definition are you working with?
yeah,
And then what changed in your mind to sort of like, reframe your thought process around God? Like you said, like a lot of the
yeah,
stuff from your atheist time didn't really change that much, but it's the way you conceptualize God. So this is always a
yeah,
million
good.
dollar question. Like how do
Yeah.
you conceptualize the ineffable, which is traditionally God, right?
Yeah, yeah, good, right. So this is big. So I said I'm a classical theist, right? And a classical theist will work with sort of certain indefinite descriptions first, right? Because obviously most theists don't want to say that, like, we can grasp the actual essence of God, right?
Hmm.
That's beyond us. But we can make true predications about God that can give us a certain theoretical entity, right? That's the way I like to think of it from a philosophical perspective. So there's certain things that classical theists say about God. But here's the other thing that I think has to be appreciated. A lot of these things that are said about God only can be said about God and will only make sense within a wider metaphysical system, right? And we can get into that as we move forward. But classical theists want to say that God is absolutely ontologically simple, that God has no real distinctions that amount to real composition. God is eternal, not just as in everlasting, but outside time altogether. God is purely actual. God's essence just is. God's existence, that comes with simplicity, that whatever is in God is God. God has the omni attributes, but qualified in a way that that a lot of contemporary theists would probably not describe them. But yeah, generally omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, right? So these are sort of the God is really distinct from the world, right? It's not a form of pantheism or panentheism, right? So these are the sort of like the core commitments of classical theism. One of the things that really differentiates the classical theist from a lot of other forms of theism, and these were the forms of theism that I think I rejected, is that commitment to simplicity, divine simplicity or ontological simplicity. And I think one of the reasons that I never really went in for the theism thing before is because the gods that were posited always they never seemed relevantly different from the sorts of things in the physical world, that I never saw much reason to accept that as a theoretical entity, with respect to what it was supposed to explain versus the greater questions that it now just raised about itself, right? The brute facts that it sort of brought into one's worldview. And that's right. I still hold that, right? In fact, I very much disagree with many, if not most, versions of contemporary theism out there. I'm still an atheist with respect to that God, right? If that makes sense, right? So yeah, that's those. Sorry, it's just kind of long-winded. But I want to make sure I kind of get it all out there as clear as I can. But that's how classical theists typically think about God, and you'll find, the core, like the core of that, or the most refined version of that in medieval thought, people like Thomas Aquinas and Scotus. But really, it's depending on how you understand or translate Plato, it's in Plato, it's in Aristotle with certain qualifications, certainly more strongly pronounced in Plotinus, right? So it's not it's by no means a Christian thing. It's in Hindu thought. There's Hindus are classical theists, Jewish thought, Maimonides, and there's little differences here or there. But classical theism it's deep and wide in the history of philosophical thought. Yeah.
Got it. And if I'm reading your work correctly, the cosmological argument, sometimes referred to as a cosmological argument, is sort of central to some of your arguments in favor of theism, correct?
Well, no. I'm actually a little bit skeptical of the cosmological argument. Yeah. So, so cosmological arguments or cosmological reasoning they're sometimes called first cause arguments, and I actually like some versions of the cosmological argument, but they're quite different than the Kalam argument. So I'll just kind of spell out some of the differences, right? I don't like the term first cause argument because I think the better formulations of cosmological arguments really look for a primary cause, which is not something that we trace back in time in a sort of linear or diachronic causal series. It's really thinking about deep dependence or metaphysical dependence relations that are synchronic, right? Sort of in the here and now, right? Why does anything exist here and now? Not what pushed the first domino type of thing. So the Kalam cosmological argument also has a long history. It's sort of seen an interesting resurgence in the contemporary literature due to certain thinkers. But what the Kalam argument is arguing is that the physical universe actually had some sort of absolute beginning, right? And then the idea there is you can join that to some sort of causal premise, right? That if something begins to exist that has a cause, it should give you the result that there's some sort of being that brought physical reality into the world. And this being presumably would be non-physical. I've got a few issues with that line of argument. So I don't actually endorse that sort of argument. The sorts of cosmological arguments that were always a little bit more interesting to me would actually concede that the universe, the physical universe itself, might be past eternal for all we need. In fact, Aquinas was big on this. Aquinas actually thought that you could not demonstrate that the physical universe had a beginning in time. He was arguing against other Christian philosophers that thought you could philosophically demonstrate that. He thought that you could not. He said you might be able to give you make it probable or something, but you couldn't give a demonstration of it, right? He thought that if you knew the universe had a physical beginning, it's because you believed that was revealed or something like that, right? But he still thought that you needed an explanation of certain large-scale phenomena, certain broad features of the world that are inherently restrictedly intelligible, right? They're the sorts of things that are not self-sufficient, right? And he thought that for these things to exist even here and now, you're going to need to make some sort of category shift, right? To something that is qualitatively very different than all the sorts of things that are contingent. If you want to focus on contingency arguments, are sort of within the family of cosmological arguments. So he's interested in demonstrating or arguing that you actually need God here and now for certain things to exist, right? As understood as a certain theoretical entity, not that you needed God sort of like 13.8 billion years ago or something like that.
Can you expand on the why? I guess I don't understand the why there.
Yeah, well, I didn't give a why because there's a whole class of families of arguments there, right? So just to give an idea of some different ways that these arguments proceed, you might think of, we'll go from Aquinas to Leibniz, right? So people might be familiar with Leibniz, one of the co-discoverers of the differential calculus. Interesting guy, quirky guy. But he thought that something called the principle of sufficient reason was true, right? And the principle of sufficient reason is Leibniz thought that for whatever exists, there's some sort of adequate explanation for why this thing exists and has the sort of characteristics that it does, right?
Can I interrupt you real quick? Like, I hate to do this, but my brain is breaking on this. When people say the why, do they mean how or why?
Well, ultimately, I think it's going to come down to a moral answer. So it will be a why for a lot of these philosophers, and that was big on Plato. If you go to sort of Plato's Republic, he gives you a sort of how in like ways that no modern physicist is ever going to accept, right? But he's like. But the how ultimately reduces to a why for Plato. So that's a really interesting thing. He thinks it ultimately reduces to an order that is the best. And Leibniz is actually pretty similar. And I don't know if he's picking up directly from Plato on that. I don't go all the way in this direction, but Leibniz is, he's often known for thinking that this is the best of all possible worlds, right? And he thinks that that's the why of why God created this world rather than some other world. There's a slight complication that I don't know if it's worth diverting into at this point with Leibniz, because he thought to get an explanation of something, you actually needed contrastive explanations. And contrastive explanations are not just why this thing exists, but why this thing exists and not some other thing, right? So that's a very strong, most philosophers don't think you need that. They think if you just want an explanation, you don't need to give contrastive explanations. I agree with that. I think asking for contrastive explanations is too much. But Leibniz thought you did have to give contrastive explanations. So he thinks PSR wraps around contingent things. He thinks contingent things are things that are possibly non-existent, right? They are, but they need not have been. They could have been otherwise. So he thinks that in order to explain contingency, you are going to need necessity, and this necessary being will have to lack all contingency implying features. Remember, his commitment to PSR is driving this. He thinks if you don't have that, you're going to have a violation of this principle that he thinks undergirds sort of all of scientific and philosophical inquiry. He's committed to the idea of that reality is intelligible. But then you also need to answer for Leibniz again, well, why did God create this contingent order rather than some other contingent order? And that's where he's going to tell you, and this is, I think, it's just a hard thing to swallow, right? Well, this must just, even if we don't see how, this must be the best of all possible worlds, right? And so there's like two ways you could think about that. I think that's interesting. So I was I guess I was more skeptical of these things. I would have thought, well, clearly this isn't the best of all possible worlds, so that argument is false. Or you could think with Leibniz, and I think these are both reasonable positions, right? It's like, well, the PSR seems damn true, right? And this is the only way to cash it out. So this must be the best of all possible worlds, right? Even if I don't see it. So you could see how there could just be like a sort of fundamental clash of intuitions around that sort of argument, and depending what you think is more pulling or more obvious to you, whether it's this sort of explanatory principle that Leibniz thinks is indispensable, or just the gratuitous evil in this world, which clearly does not speak of a best of all possible worlds. You could sort of run it in either direction, right?
Yeah, so totally get that. I'm tracking all of that, and I'm still falling down on why the need for a God, right? Like it's still like I'm not seeing. And by the way, I've searched and I've asked this question a million times, and I can't get over the hump of like, why? Like why do we have to insert this as opposed to just be like, this universe exists, we're all a part of it. You want to go from a Cartesian perspective, at least I know I exist because I'm thinking, right? And I'm here experiencing it. Why the necessity for a God? Like that part, it just breaks my brain. I cannot, no matter how hard I wrestle with it, I just can't come to grips with a need to insert that.
Yeah. So let's break it into the cosmological argument in two phases. This is sometimes how it's broken into literature, right? The first phase might just be arguing for a necessary being of some sort, right? And there's a lot of atheists nowadays. I don't have a survey of it, but some very prominent ones in philosophy of religion that actually accept pretty much everything that was just said of a contingency argument. And they'll say, yeah, no, I think we do need to ground contingency and necessity ultimately. Like that's something we need to do if we're going to make sense of a contingent order. But why, and I think this is what you're getting at, right? Why does that necessary being have to be God, right?
Well, I'll take it a step further. I don't see a necessity for a contingent being. Like I don't.
You don't see it. Well, that's the nature of contingency, is it's not necessary, right?
Sorry, whatever the opposite of that is. Like
you don't see
the need for a prime mover or a the causal be some cause for everything that we see. Like I don't find a need to insert that, and maybe I'm just ignorant and I'm missing something super important, but I just can't figure out why we need to have this being to just exist in this universe.
Yeah, well, so you've asked two things now, and started to go one way, but we can come back the other way if we want. So if you're asking, well, why does the necessary being have to be God? If you accept there's a necessary being, that's one question. Very good one. It's a tough one. Or you're asking, why does there have to be a necessary being in the first place? So if we're focused on the first one, the answer is going to come down to whether you think that some sort of explanatory principle is sufficiently motivated or justified, right? Something like Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, or other philosophers might talk about principle of intelligibility, or just various explanations of various explanatory principles. And the reason a lot of philosophers hold to these principles is they seem to be necessary to undergird certain practices, especially practices in science, philosophy, and epistemology, right? Very important in epistemology. It's hard to have a theory of knowledge without a sort of broad enough explanatory principle. Otherwise, you sort of run into skeptical scenarios, or it's hard to see when certain things would count as scientific knowledge, for example. And
can you explain that more? Like,
So
I think I'm just dumb.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah, no. So I'll give you one example that's sort of common in some of the literature. Philosophers might say something like this: hey, if contingent things can just sort of be brute facts, and a brute fact is something that seems to require a further explanation, right? It's not self-explanatory, right? But there's nothing that explains it, right? You can ask all the questions you want, but reality doesn't care. It's not going to answer back. It's just a brute fact. It's there. That's it. Move on with your life. A good example of this would be what Bertrand Russell actually famously said of the universe one time.
The teapot thing?
No, it's not his teapot example. It's in a debate he had. It's a very interesting exchange because it's two high-level philosophers kind of going at it. It's him and a philosopher, Frederick Coppelton. And they're kind of pushing along these lines. And at one point, Russell just says, the universe is just there. That's all. Stop asking questions about it, right? That's an idea of a brute fact. Maybe it does make sense to ask why it's there. I think most people think that it's coherent. But you're a little too optimistic, right? There's no reason to think that anything should actually account for this. All right. So if you think that there can be brute facts of certain things, this starts to become problematic in epistemology, because that would apply to certain cognitive states, memory beliefs, any sorts of beliefs that we form, that they might not be reliably linked up with the world in certain ways, that for all I know now, my memory beliefs could have just popped in from nowhere and the world was just created 5 minutes ago, right? It raises all sorts of weird skeptical scenarios, right? So there's all sorts of examples like that. And most people think that that's not right? That's not true.
So that's like the radical skeptics, their approach, right? And I think that's largely been solved, right? And from the perspective of, we all understand that we have to all work from first principles. There's certain axiomatic assumptions that we must, in order to even think or speak or act in the world, we have to take these assumptions as like, that's like the minimum level of assumptions we must make, and everyone has to make them. Number one, that our senses are valid, right? Sense data is valid, and that we can know something about the universe, and there's some base level assumptions that we all must make. But beyond that, I guess that's where I'm getting at, is like with that understanding that we all must make these certain axiomatic assumptions to even think, act, communicate. Even something simple as like, that's intelligible, like my words, you're going to be able to understand them, like that you exist, that you exist separate from me, right? Like all these base level assumptions we all must make, regardless of whether we take a theist approach or atheist approach or whatever.
No, I agree. You're right.
And so with that understanding and that sort of undergirding, like now I'm struggling to understand why we have to have a God in the picture.
We're getting there.
Okay,
Trust
cool.
me, right? We're taking our time. I think most of us agree that we do have knowledge. We have to act, at least generally, right? That what our senses gives us is generally the case. It's defeasible, right? We can be wrong because we are wrong, right?
All the time.
But we always correct ourselves using our senses, right? So like, we can't be wrong all the way through, or else even the idea of correction doesn't make sense, right? But we still need principles to kind of shore all that up, right? Otherwise, it remains unjustified, and we still land in these radically skeptical scenarios. So that's why a lot of these sort of explanatory principles that might do work in a cosmological argument, right, are argued for dialectically. A lot of them, because you, like you said, first principles, right? If it's first, you can't argue from beneath it, right? So they're argued dialectically for, because it's like trying to deny the principle of contradiction. Well, everything flows from a principle. How do I argue for it? Well, you argue for it by showing, well, if you deny it, all this bad stuff happens, right? That's the idea, right? And Leibniz was big about this. Aristotle was big about this, right? You can try to show performative contradictions, but generally the strategy is it just lands you in sort of utter incoherence or radical skepticism or other forms of contradiction whatsoever, right? All right, so to piece some of this together, if you think that's right, and that these various lines of thought kind of give you reason to accept a very broad explanatory principle like this, then if that principle has a sufficient amount of range over certain types of entities, like the type contingent, then you're going to have to explain the type contingent with the type necessity to avoid circularity, right? So that's where that's coming from. And that's something that, again, that does not need to, and I think should not, divide a theist and atheist. Many atheists accept that, right? They're like, yeah, actually, there's a lot of powerful reasons to think that there has to be something necessary, that it can't be contingency through and through, even no matter whether there's an infinite number of contingent things, no matter how they're arranged. It seems like we really do need to explain why there's anything of the type contingent, that whatever explanatory or causal principles we're committed to do wrap around that type, right? And that's what's getting to the idea of a necessary being, right?
And so that would be the divergence then between theists and like panpsychists or deists or something like that, right? Like that would be just a different conception of what that necessary thing is, right?
Yeah. So that's a good point. So at this point, and this is why these conversations are so, I think, useful, because like at this point, if you're like committed to any position, a naturalist position, a deist position, if you're a panpsychist, which that comes in, like, you could be a panpsychist naturalist or a panpsychist theist. That comes in lots of different flavors too, right? You can all be on board with that, right? Right? There's nothing like you can all sign, and many do. I know panpsychists that accept that type of argument. Philip Goff, as far as I'm concerned, one of the leading panpsychists out there, right? I'm pretty sure accepts. Yeah, he does, because he actually holds to a form of limited theism. So he would be a panpsychist that would go along with that idea. I know naturalists that hold to the idea of a necessary reality, right? So that's why these conversations are good, but they're also kind of, the way that you're picking apart is really helpful, because it shows like, okay, well, what's sort of motivating this? What are the pieces to the puzzle? And is this something that not only should I disagree with, but like, even if I'm committed to my position, do I have to disagree with it, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I honestly think, like, if you think that there's like amazing reasons to be a position, like that position is a reason to, reject something else. We all do that all the time. So I don't think that that's like totally irrational to do. I think, of course, you want to sort of weigh everything out eventually. But right. So yeah, at this point, everything we've said just so far is compatible with pretty much everything I can think of in terms of what's on the worldview scene, aside from like somebody who, I guess, for whatever reason, just doesn't want to accept that there's any necessity in reality whatsoever, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to give you to peel the covers back of where my head is at. But actually, let me give you a little backstory. So I was raised hyper Catholic, right? So I think
hyper Catholic, yeah.
I mean, like really hyper Catholic.
Yeah, on Twitter, I think you said intense Catholic. I love it.
Yeah, like I mean, my mom's cousin was a Jesuit in the Vatican, like taught theology at Boston University, like super Catholic, right? So I started there, went to a Catholic school, went Protestant for a while, and then I became an atheist. Became pretty militant atheist, Reddit type for a hot minute, because I was a little bit injured by religion.
Sorry to hear that, man. I hear those stories a lot. And I don't mean to interject. I want you to finish, but I just never had religious experiences growing up. So like I never had the good or the bad. But like, since I have become, Catholic, I've had a lot of people reach out with these stories, and it's awful, man. I hate to hear it, and I understand why people go in those directions. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I didn't really have any religious experiences, though. You called that out, like I didn't have any, and that was one of the things that was interesting to me. It was just dead, right? Regardless whether it was Protestantism or Catholicism or whatever. I went through the motions. I thought I believed this stuff, and there was just nothing there. Since then, I talk about this quite a bit, is I've had some pretty deep psychedelic experiences, which have completely opened my mind,
I've heard that among a number of people.
yeah, completely humbled me into a point where I'm now just so open, and I'm searching, and I'm trying to make sense out of some of those experiences. And I think my view is informed by having those experiences, right? If you've been on a psychedelic, like a really deep experience, you get this sense of everything being connected. Right. So when I look at the universe, I kind of take the view that's more of the deist approach, that like the universe is like one thing. Right. So are you familiar with mirrorology?
Yeah. I actually do a bit of work in mereology.
Yeah, I can't even pronounce it.
So do you mean deist or do you mean pantheist? So when I think of deist, it might be just, terms people use them differently. But when I think of deist, I think of a god that sort of is,
just set things in motion, like, and just disconnected,
standoff. Maybe he flicked the first domino, but he's off doing more seemly recreations, right? But it's still distinct from the universe, really distinct. Whereas the pantheist or panentheist wants to say the universe is to various extents a part of God. So,
God. It's kind of like the sense that I get, that
right.
The entire universe is like this connected thing. And it's like Carl Sagan said, like the most profound thing he can think of is that all of the instantiations of life in the universe are the universe perceiving itself, right? So I'm kind of in that vein. It's kind of like I'm not me.
I'm attracted. I was and still am attracted to views along that as well. And I think the lines between a panentheism and a classical theism get very, very blurry at certain points. If somebody hasn't read a really very cool thinker, David Bentley Hart, he's got a book called We Are All Gods. Mm-hmm. That's essentially his thesis, because he's a classical theist, but he's also kind of arguing for a panentheism. So there's a lot of fruitful dialogue kind of happening between those. Sorry to interject again, but
no,
get me excited, man. It's good stuff.
Hey,
continue.
I appreciate that, because like I'm just trying to explain sort of where I've landed, and I've thought deeply about this, and this is where I sort of have trouble with the cosmological arguments with necessary and contingent beings, and like I don't see a need for a necessary being, other than if you were to say that the universe itself is that necessary being, right? And I'm also very open to the idea of the multiverse, right? And I think there's a lot of scientific evidence that seems to indicate that there are, like, for example, you talk about supermassive black holes, or some science around it. They think that you could potentially come up with a singularity, much like the environment in which our early universe formed, and we might just end up in a fractal universe, that we're just one bubble in this giant fractal universe. And if you've had a deep psychedelic experience, you have this experience of fractals, right? So everything is A, connected, and B, infinite and fractal, and every possibility like plays out, and that to me it resonates with me. But admittedly, hey, I was taking drugs, right? Like I had this experience mediated by the substance, and although it was powerful and it connected and all that stuff, like I'm also skeptical of the experience, because like, well, hey, who the hell knows what to make out of that?
Yeah, but I hear, I've never done psychedelics. Two questions. So one, you feel you don't feel the need for necessary being unless it's the universe. Is that it? Or?
Yeah, because it's like we know.
So does that mean, just to clarify, does that mean you do feel that there's a need for necessary being, but you think it should be the universe, or you don't feel there's a need for necessary being, but you would just be okay with saying it's?
Well, I don't think there's a need at all for a necessary. Well, I mean, this is where I like the limits of my
no, this is good, man. I enjoy hearing it.
But essentially, the cosmological arguments typically go along the lines of, hey, anything that began to exist has a cause, and then it posits the God as the cause, right? Where I'm thinking, like, there's no evidence at all, or I think compelling reason to believe that there is any such thing as the universe being caused, right? So you look at the laws of thermodynamics. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. You talk about the early universe, people oftentimes like, well, what happened before the Big Bang? Which it seems like an unintelligible question.
Well, if it's the beginning of time, there's no before.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so there's this limit, and it's it's a epistemological limit, really. This is the limit of our knowledge. Like, if you
Could be, right?
Could be, sure.
Test it.
People make
Test it, yeah.
philosophical claims about, all sorts of things, but when it comes to like, how would you test that? When you understand
From empirical knowledge, I agree. There are hard limits, right?
Sure,
yes.
sure. That's what I mean. So from an empirical standpoint, at least with our current understanding, obviously it could all be overturned and we can figure this out. But as of today, there's like a limit how far back you can go, and then basically all of the laws of physics sort of break down. Right, when you get to far enough back, and you can't really like time doesn't exist, space doesn't exist. It's like a singularity, infinitely hot, infinitely dense. Just things our brains can't even comprehend what that early part of the universe was like, or if there was a cause, like I mentioned earlier, like maybe supermassive black hole in a different dimension caused this to spit out. Like we're just speculating, and I think that's what philosopher is the trap they get into, is that they a lot of these questions, even if you think about them real hard, you're ultimately just speculating.
Well, it depends. It depends on the type of arguments that you're making. I mean, I think philosophy can prove things. Sometimes they're trivial things, right? But we can't adjudicate certain empirical matters, right? Because philosophy is done largely from the armchair, right?
Correct.
So to your points, I mean, you've expressed some of the concerns that I have of the Kalam cosmological argument, right? Is like, when we look at the physics, okay, it's interesting, but I don't think it gives everything that the certain proponents of the cosmological argument want for whatever premise that is, the second premise or whatever, right? The multiverse seems like a live option, and then there's things that people say about the multiverse, and certain theorems of why even that would have to be getting. And I have to confess, I'm a little bit skeptical of those as well. I think you might be able to. I think you might be able to give like a probabilistic argument, right? And that's fine. You can say okay, or you could put it in like in terms of expectation. Would I be more likely to kind of find this sort of thing happening on a theistic hypothesis versus a naturalistic hypothesis? That would be a more modest way to try and get some weights in the scale, right? Because then you're not talking about like proofs or something like that. So those I'm just trying to like both like play skeptic, which I am of that with you, but also trying to like steelman it a little bit, right? Because I don't endorse that argument at the end of the day. Or if I did, it would have to be not through the scientific considerations, but the philosophical considerations. And this is where there's some interesting work done. I'm not an expert in this field, but you might want to look into it, or the people might be interested, of a thesis called causal finitism. And the idea of causal finitism, there's a brilliant philosopher out, his name's Alex Proust. He's got a book out called Causation, Infinity, and Paradox. And he thinks that if you allow for infinite causal chains, and the book is just full of just high-level paradoxes, it's brilliant, you get all sorts of absurdities and contradictions. And if you think contradictions are impossible, then you should be a causal finitist, meaning that there's no one effect that is preceded by an infinite number of causes. If that thesis is true, then you can run the Kalam argument, right? You can. But I'll leave that investigation. But those are philosophical thought experiments. They're not empirical. It's not the science that's doing the work. So I'll say I'm agnostic on that. I haven't really adjudicated that. Isn't the area that I've spent a lot of time. But this is recent. Like, this is debate that's going on in the literature right now around that thesis. So it's interesting. And some of the paradoxes are really strange and puzzling, and some of them do kind of give you contradictions which seem that are hard to avoid. So there's that. Sorry, I lost the train of thought now of what we were talking about originally.
I was just up to my question about why the need for a necessary.
Oh, a necessary being, right? Yeah. So let me think about it this way, right? So here's just kind of like an interesting thought experiment. This is sort of a Leibnizian way of sort of thinking about it. Could everything just collectively, and you don't have to think, it's like mereology, you don't have to think that everything forms like one big single composite whole. You can just think in aggregate, right? Like, could everything even collectively be caused? I think we can say definitely not, right? Because beyond that, there's nothing. So not everything can be caused, right? For sure, right? Because beyond everything, there's nothing, and nothing can act as cause. So that means, I think that really does mean that something has to be uncaused, right? something, at least one thing has
And
to
I
be
agree,
uncaused.
right? And so
Yeah.
my view currently is that the universe is uncaused.
Maybe it's that. Yeah,
yeah. So
sure,
I'm
right.
kind of sort of partial to the you know, and this is where I
Yeah.
think that we're all arriving at the same place, but maybe definitionally.
Maybe. Yeah.
Whereas I think the universe, like it fills the need for that sort of eternal thing that was uncaused.
It
It's just
could.
like my view is like, you know, maybe
Maybe.
this thing is completely eternal. There's no possible. This really comes down to the question of, is there a possibility of
Yeah.
nothing existing, right? And I
Yeah.
would claim that no, there is no option of nothing existing.
So then that would be a reason to hold to a necessary being, right? Some sort of necessity. And I'm with you. I agree with that, right? And I think that those types of considerations are extremely, I mean, they convinced me. They seemed convincing at the time, and the more I've thought about them, they seem all the more convincing. So you're right again to observe that we've just really, if we've proven anything, if you want to use that strong word, not theism or atheism, that just not everything can be caused. But that's significant, right? That's kind of a cool result, right? It's not it, because most of the things seem caused, right? We look around, like we constantly search for causes. So it is not like sometimes people say philosophy is trivial. Maybe it's close to trivial, but sometimes it's really significant, right? Like the fact that, okay, at least something, whatever it is, you can talk about it isn't caused, is uncaused.
Mm-hmm.
That's like pretty fantastic, right? That's fantastic.
Well, it kind of is, but I also feel like it exposes us for being kind of dummies, right? Because I think that we look at deep questions of the universe or God, or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
and we try to apply temporal phenomena like causality to something like that, right? Because and this is where
causality does not have to be temporal, though. So for example, the cosmology I'm talking about, or talk about what's called metaphysical dependence, right, or synchronic dependence, and it's not a temporal notion of causality.
Well, maybe that's where I'm dumb. Maybe I'm the dumb one. I probably am. But I was, you know, I'm thinking about this whole causal chain phenomenon, and like this is where mirrorology got my attention, right? Because when you come to the arguments of like, well, I have a cause, right? So I was caused by something that preceded me. With mirrorology, you know, some variant of it is saying like ultimately, look, we are in the universe, and ultimately everything is just pushing atoms around. We have matter and energy bouncing around the universe and taking various forms, but nothing was ever actually caused. If you accept that the universe that we live in is eternal, it didn't have a cause, and you know, like we're just moving things or shuffling things around essentially, and you know, obviously there is you know, physics exists and biological processes exist, and there was a cause because there was a sperm and an egg and it grew into a person, you know, those things are temporally caused. Maybe you could explain what I'm missing on the metaphysical side, because it feels to me like we're trying to take this sort of experiential temporal causality that we're used to you know, dealing with in our day-to-day world, and then trying to apply that same paradigm to something higher order, right?
A lot of good stuff. I have about 15 minutes left, so we'll have to do like a part 2, right? For sure.
100%.
So because I want to get back to why should we think the uncaused cause is God, right? And I think there's actually a lot of good reasons for that in terms of explanatory power and also shaving what's called arbitrary limits and reducing brute. There's actually a lot of good reasons, but maybe we could just save that for part 2. I also would say I don't think that somebody who's a panentheist has to like reject those lines of thought. You might actually find them very attractive. Mereology. So what you said, it sounded like almost for a minute that you're endorsing like mereological nihilism, right? That, you know, things are just rearranged. There's just metaphysical symbols. There's no like Pat Flynn. There's just certain symbols arranged Pat Flynn wise, right? I think that position is definitely false. It's hugely controversial. Certainly nothing in science gives you that. That's a philosophy added to science. I think it leads to all sorts of... So for people who aren't familiar, mereology is a study of parts and wholes. That's what mereology is, right? And there's what might be called a special composition question in mereology. And a special composition is, when do things form other things, like unified composite objects, right? And the simplest way to break this down is the mereological nihilist will say, never, right? Things never form other things. There's only radical simples, whatever they are. And then people will debate whether it's particles or something lower. What, it doesn't matter. You don't have to,
sure,
right? like I said, that's a pretty extreme position because people think like, no, man, I'm a unified whole, dude. I'm not just like.
And this, hey, here's my point
Yeah.
now. This you walked right into this one. Is people say I am a whole. I am right? But if you know anything about science, every atom in your body has been replaced. You know, it gets replaced every 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you
doesn't
as
mean
you
I'm
exist,
replaced. Just means that I have parts that could be swapped in and out. It's a ship of
well, and
Theseus, right?
that comes to the question of what does I mean? If you can take 100% of what was you, and then all of a sudden you have no particles at all in your entire body that were the old you, which you was you at that wit time, right?
Me, the substance, Pat Flynn. So the only reason somebody would have to go with that sort of nihilistic view that I'm no longer me because all my proper parts have been put out is because you're a physicalist reductionist, and I would just challenge that thesis. There's no reason to accept that view, right? So let me go through the other positions in mereology, and I'll show what I think is a good middle way. And by the way, it's important to understand in mereology, these positions are empirically equivalent, right? So they're all compatible with the science, right? This is why this is, where we're talking about where the boundaries are not always so clear, right? They're empirically equivalent. So this is not a dispute that science itself can settle. So, the mereological nihilist says never. Then there's mereological universalism. And mereological universalism says always, things always. So this means this position is strange too, right? Because it says you can point to any random things and they form a legitimate object. You can point to this cup, your beard, and the Mona Lisa. And that's a legitimate object, right? A tightly unified whole. And most people would say, again, like, no, that just seems sort of crazy. And by the way, there's more sophisticated arguments against both these positions, but I think most people will just say, okay, I'll give you the prima facie on this, right? These just seem really weird, unintuitive, right? And then there's what is probably the most popular position, but it's hard to work out, which is some sort of moderatism, right? Or some sort of a sort of sometimes answer. When do things form legitimate wholes? The answer is sometimes, right? And then this is where you will have different answers of what those conditions are of when, certain wholes are formed. And you've got all sorts of, this is a huge debate. Like this is mereology, right? This is what they debate. I'm very inclined to an Aristotelian view, right? So I don't think that you just are a bunch of physical bits. I actually think you have metaphysical parts such as form and matter, and that you're a legitimate substance, that you are actually more fundamental than your parts, right? So this is known as reverse mereological essentialism.
Got it. This alludes to, sorry, real quick, this alludes to like the neo-amenal realm or the, Platonic realm of forms or some sort of abstract.
Yeah, Aristotle's different than Plato significantly on this, because how you think about properties and universals, if you think they're transcendent, right, and exist in sort of Plato's heaven, then you're in kind of Camp Plato. If you think, no, I'm not going for a whole, realm of abstract objects just out there existing, that sounds a little too spooky or strange, then you might be what's called an immanent realist and think, no, that these sort of properties, universals are just in the things themselves, right, as the principles of configuration, right? And I think this is a really good position in mereology. I think it solves a lot of problems concerning problems of composition, and we can sort of identify when there is a legitimate whole, when there are dependence relations where with respect to from whole to part, right? When you can identify where there are whole dependent parts, that's where one of the signs of when you have a legitimate sort of new, sort of fundamental object in your ontology, right? So for the Aristotelian, substances are fundamental. Like we are fundamental, right? Doesn't mean there aren't other fundamental things, right? But certainly we would count as a substance because we meet that criteria of having whole dependent parts, right? Whereas you might have other things that have whole independent parts. Think of a pile of sand, right? That's clearly an aggregate. So we would say, no, there's not like a real object there. There's just an aggregate. There's nothing over and above the pile of sand. So you're bringing up like really good, important issues that factor into all sorts of considerations in all areas of philosophy. But I would definitely not go the route of mereological nihilism. If you do, I think it's got rather dire consequences for a lot of things. not just ontology, but also ethics and epistemology and stuff too. There's a lot of issues with it, which is why most philosophers want to avoid it. The only reason that people go to it is because they feel like they can't really answer that special composition question legitimately. But I think Aristotelianism can, and there's a lot of like really great resurgence of literature on this for people who are interested in these issues. Yeah,
I'd love to dive into that a little bit more, because kind of where I've landed is that this is really a question of concept formation, right? So it's a definitional question. How do we define something that we would call a whole, right? It doesn't apply necessarily to the objective universe, right? This is not an empirical question, because take the human body, like I said, your parts all get replaced, and also I think of human, like everything in a human being, I think, can't remember how much, like 60% is not even human cells, like it's bacteria and a bunch of other stuff too. And so for me, I've just looked at it as like, I do believe that things are just kind of like matter that get pushed around. Like you have the universe, you have energy, you have matter, takes different shapes, takes different forms. There's different processes that are happening. But ultimately, it's a categorization effort where human beings are like, okay, I have this concept formation process we have to undertake to move, through the universe and to gather resources, and reproduce, and all these sorts of things. Concepts are useful. And so I'm looking at this as more like a concept formation exercise and a definitional exercise, as opposed to something that is fundamentally important. And this is where I want to dive into this, because I feel like I'm probably missing something very, very important.
Well, that itself is really important, because nobody denies that there's concepts in play. We're trying to form our concepts, but are we conceptualists, nominalists, or realists, right? That's part of the debate, right? So the realist is going to say, no, our concepts are formed not always perfect, but they're formed by the way the world really is, right? That there are these forms and configuring principles, essences in things, right? And when we come to know things, we're kind of having a dual instantiation of the forms in an intentional way versus in a real way or material way out in the world. So that's a sort of Aristotelian view. That's a realist view. I would also say that that's just the common sense view. Then there are conceptualist views which say, nah, the world is just sort of, we are just imposing or constructing those concepts for matters of practical utility, organization, or whatever, right? But it doesn't reflect the way that the world really is. So those would be sort of a conceptualist view or something like that, right? You can probably guess which way that I lean, right? I'm an Aristotelian.
And this is where, like, I feel like I'm missing the boat, because I don't see this guy. I keep going back to this. I don't see a need to invoke that, right? Like the sort of like this realm of perfect forms, or there's some other thing that's hovering above, some metaphysical thing that there's no null hypothesis.
Realm of perfect forms would be Plato. So I would want to resist that too. So I'm with you, right? Need to invoke it. Well, I think there's lots of reasons to invoke it. One is we want to explain why things maintain their identity through change, through swapping out of material parts. Essences do a lot of work there. Also in ethics, we think that we want to ground certain notions like equality and human dignity and stuff like that. What could ground that, right? If we're all sort of radically different or radically individual. So I think there's needs in ethics. I think there's needs in ontology. I think there's needs in mereology to say that these aren't just constructs. These are things in the real world. So I actually think there's a ton of need for it, right? There's a ton of need in terms of like the descriptive and explanatory work that being a real essentialist does across many different branches of philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, like I hinted at, right? And I would say there's no need or good reason to just be a conceptualist or a nominalist. I don't see what motivates that, right? A real essentialism does a lot of work in terms of explanation and description across a host of issues, and to just sort of give that up doesn't strike me as very wise, right? Unless there's like some really good arguments against it, and I've never encountered those.
Got it. Yeah. Well, as you can tell, I'm bumping up against the limits of my knowledge, and as a lay philosopher. So I appreciate you, poking at some things. And I definitely, if you can direct me to some material or something I can sort of, sink my teeth into. I'm open to the concepts. I've got a lot of learning left to do.
Two books I'll give for anybody interested, especially on that issue. Real Essentialism by David Oderberg. That is a defense of this broadly Aristotelian position, which again, I think like if you think like, I don't want to go all the way with this Platonic realm of forms, which is more of a relational ontology. I hold to a constituent ontology. There's some major differences between the two. But Real Essentials by David Oderberg. And then another really great book is Thought and World by James Ross. He was a really brilliant man who was at University of Pennsylvania for many, many years. And that's another book that defends real essentialism. And if you want a great book on mereology, it comes from a philosopher named Ross Inman, and it's called, you have to excuse me as I Google it because I think it's Substance and, if you just Google Ross, Substance and the Fundamentality of the Familiar, a neo-Aristotelian approach, I think is what it is called. And that is a great book that just sort of dives into all these puzzles in mereology. We've touched on a few of them here, but there's a lot more, right? And showing how this sort of neo-Aristotelian understanding gives you that long sought after but difficult to find sort of moderate position, right, to avoid the two extremes and help us identify, what's fundamental when the holes are and stuff like that. So those would be some resources for people to dive into if they're interested in these. Very tough, as we said at the beginning of the conversation, right? That philosophy is hard. These are tough things to think about, man. I know I've been wrestling them for years and years and years. Still wrestling with all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm.
Yep. And the benefit to this, or like the consolation I get, is that humans have been wrestling with this stuff for thousands of years, and some very, very smart people, way smarter than me, have got hung up on all of these same topics. And so I really enjoy just playing with the ideas and going deeper and talking to people who are way more knowledgeable than me, so I can sort of up level my philosophy game.
Well, dude, thank you, man. This has been really fascinating for me too, and we'll chat again for sure. And I want to hear more about, because we kind of touched on the psychedelic stuff. I'm actually very interested to hear more about that and just explore around. And
cool. And I want to dive into how you end up being a Catholic too, like the whole us taking opposite trajectories here. Like I'm so interested to see how, like, what the thought process that or experiential process that led to adopting that belief. That's super interesting subject matter for me.
Yeah, cool, brother. Well, we'll make that happen at some point. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me. This has been one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had in a very long time. So thank you for pulling up. And then please tell everyone where they can find you.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. Yeah, likewise. Really enjoyed this. It's been great. Where can you find me? If you're interested in philosophy stuff, my channel is Philosophy for the People on YouTube. Pretty active on Substack though too. So I have the very humbly named Substack called the Journal of Absolute Truth, so you can head over there and check that stuff out. Self-reviewed journal, of course, so it's just gonna be top rate, right? Yeah,
fantastic. And then also remember, The Best Argument for God, the book is out. Go pick up a copy.
Thanks, brother.
All right, man. Well, we'll chat later. I really enjoyed it, and talk to you in a bit.